The briefing room smelled like recycled air and bad decisions, which, in Finn Drake's experience, was the standard atmosphere for any room where someone was about to hand him a job he hadn't asked for. He'd been on the asterisk meridian, packed for 6 hours, before anyone bothered to tell him why. 6 hours of narrow corridors with walls that hummed at a frequency just below conscious irritation. Of crew members who looked at him the way people look at a piece of furniture they aren't sure belongs in the room. Of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in a previous geological era and simply reheated across the centuries. He had spent those 6 hours reviewing what little his contract had told him. Diplomatic protection detail, interstellar vessel, duration approximately 11 days, compensation generous enough that he'd stopped asking questions somewhere around the 3rd decimal place. The man who finally came for him introduced himself as Coordinator Ussel, a thin, precise individual in a gray uniform that seemed tailored less for comfort and more for the projection of administrative authority. He had the kind of face that had never, not once, found anything particularly funny, and he walked like a man who had attended a seminar on walking and taken meticulous notes. "Mr. Drake." He didn't offer a hand. "Follow me, please." They moved through the ship's inner corridor, toward what the asterisk meridian-packed asterisk schematics called the briefing annex, a name that made it sound far more impressive than the narrow, overlit room with a single table and a wall-mounted display that greeted them on arrival. Finn sat. Ussel stood. The display flickered on. "You've been selected for close protection duty on behalf of the Concord diplomatic mission," Ussel began, folding his hands behind his back in a way that suggested this was a practice gesture, rehearsed for occasions when he needed to appear both serious and geometrically symmetrical. "You come recommended from 3 separate agencies, and your file indicates prior experience guarding high-profile individuals in contested environments." "That's a diplomatic way of putting it," Finn said. Ussel looked at him. "I once spent 9 days guarding a senator who was convinced the catering staff was orchestrating a political conspiracy through the medium of canapé selection," Finn offered. "So yes, contested environments." Ussel blinked once slowly, like a man filing the comment away in a drawer he intended never to open, and continued. "The mission, as it was laid out over the next 20 minutes, was this. The asterisk meridian pact was en route to the Concord Summit, a gathering that represented, depending on who you asked, either humanity's greatest diplomatic achievement or its most ambitious act of collective wishful thinking. 17 species, 1 station, 11 days of structured dialogue on the framework of interstellar cooperation, trade access, and the finer points of not accidentally starting wars over navigational rights in shared space corridors. It was, Ussel explained, an occasion of enormous political sensitivity." Finn nodded at intervals, in the way of a man who is listening and also quietly calculating how many cups of the terrible coffee it would take to make it drinkable. Then the display changed and the file opened, and Finn stopped calculating. The woman on the screen was, and he chose the word carefully, even internally striking. Not in the aggressive, sculptural way that security files sometimes captured public figures, with their professional photographs and their curated angles. She was striking the way certain things are striking when they are simply, quietly, undeniably present. Pale skin with a quality to it like winter light through frosted glass, black hair that fell in a straight, unhurried line past her shoulders, and a stillness in her expression that suggested she was either profoundly calm or profoundly bored, and had long ago learned to make both look identical. She could have passed at a glance and at distance for human. It was the ears that clarified things, long, elegantly tapered, curving upward from where a human ear would begin and continuing past it in a smooth arc, not dramatically, not cartoonishly, but unmistakably. The kind of ears that belonged to someone from a great deal further away than the next continent. "Princess Nithara," Ussel said, with the tone of a man introducing a very important document. sole heir to the Velshara Dominion. She is traveling aboard this vessel as part of the Dominion's diplomatic delegation, and will be attending the Concord Summit as her civilization's primary representative. She is 26 years of age by the Velshara calendar, 31 by ours, and she has not traveled beyond Dominion space before. This is her first contact with human-operated infrastructure at any meaningful scale. So she's never been on a ship like this, Finn said. Correct. And we've put her on a ship that smells like this. Ussel's expression performed a subtle maneuver that wasn't quite a wince. Your assignment, he said, redirecting with practiced efficiency, is close protection. You will maintain a protective perimeter during all transit periods, accompany her to any non-restricted areas of the vessel, and station yourself outside her secured quarters during rest periods. You will not enter her quarters under any circumstances short of a direct emergency. You will maintain professional distance. You will not initiate unnecessary conversation. He paused. You will not stare at her ears. Finn looked up from the file. Has that been a problem? It has been a note, Ussel said, with the careful precision of a man who has written the note himself, that we are choosing to issue preemptively. He was handed a physical dossier, a deliberate diplomatic gesture, Ussel explained, as the Velshara placed significant cultural weight on the material transfer of information, along with an access card, a comm device, and a small laminated sheet of Velshara greeting protocols that included, on the reverse side, a list of 14 things one should not say to a member of the royal household, the last of which was underlined twice and simply read, "Do not comment on the navigational capabilities of the Dominion fleet, regardless of context." Finn tucked the laminated sheet into his jacket pocket. He looked once more at the photograph on the display, at the winter-pale face and the dark eyes and the long, composed ears, and felt the particular sensation he always felt at the beginning of a job that was going to be more complicated than the paperwork suggested. He picked up the dossier. "When do I meet her?" he asked. "In approximately 40 minutes, Ussel said, already moving toward the door. "She has just disembarked from the shuttle connecting from the Dominion transit vessel." He paused at the threshold. "Mr. Drake, I want to be clear. This assignment is of significant political sensitivity. The princess's comfort, safety, and experience aboard this vessel reflect directly on the success of the Concord mission." "Understood," Finn said. "Do not make it strange," Ussel said. "I never make it strange," Finn said. Ussel looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who had read a file thoroughly and had opinions about it, and then he left. Finn sat alone in the briefing room for a moment, the dossier in his hands, the display still glowing with the princess's photograph. He looked at the ears again, briefly, professionally, in the way one notes a distinguishing feature for identification purposes, and then he looked away. 40 minutes. He went to find something that might generously be described as coffee. Princess Nithara arrived with the quiet confidence of someone who had been told, many times over the course of her life, that rooms were supposed to adjust themselves to her presence, and who had privately decided that this was an unreasonable expectation, but had never quite found the right moment to say so. Finn saw her from the end of the corridor, where he'd positioned himself with the careful casualness of a man pretending he hadn't been standing there for 11 minutes. She came through the docking connector, with 2 Velshara attendants flanking her at a respectful distance, and Coordinator Ussel moving alongside her with the focused energy of a man, desperately hoping nothing would go wrong in the next 30 seconds. She wore traveling clothes in deep gray and blue, fabrics that moved with her in a way that suggested they were either extraordinarily well-made or possessed of some mild engineering Finn's dossier hadn't covered. Her black hair was pulled back. Her expression was composed in the way of someone observing everything and revealing nothing. Her eyes found him before Ussel had finished the introduction. That was the first thing Finn noted, not as attraction, not as anything particularly personal, but as the professional observation of a man whose job required him to notice how people scanned rooms. She clocked him the way someone clocks an exit, directly, efficiently, and without pretending she hadn't. "Mr. Drake," Ussel said, arriving at the conclusion of a sentence Finn had partially missed, "will be your primary protection officer for the duration of your time aboard the Meridian Pact." Nithara looked at him, not at his jacket or his comm device or the laminated card-shaped outline visible through his breast pocket. At him. "You are smaller than I expected," she said. Her standard was precise and slightly formal, the way it gets when someone has learned a language from sources that were thorough but perhaps not entirely current. Finn processed this. "I get that a lot," he said. "The Velshara protection caste tends toward greater physical scale." "I've found," Finn said, with the measured calm of a man selecting his words the way a person selects footing on uncertain terrain, "that being difficult to see coming has its own advantages." Something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one, the way a room changes when someone opens a window without yet letting in the light. She said nothing further. Ussel exhaled almost inaudibly and the small procession moved on. The first few hours were, professionally speaking, textbook. Finn maintained his perimeter. He learned the relevant geography of the Meridian Pact S diplomatic wing. The observation lounge, where Nithara spent an hour standing at the long viewport, watching the star field with an expression of careful neutrality that he suspected, was covering something considerably less neutral. The small conference room where she met with a Velshara aide over documents he wasn't cleared to see. The narrow corridor between these 2 points that he walked approximately 900 times. She asked him one question during the afternoon, which was whether the ship's artificial gravity was running at standard human calibration. He told her it was. She nodded as though this confirmed a suspicion. He didn't ask which suspicion. The dossier had mentioned, on page 7, that the Velshara operated their vessels at 83% standard gravity, and that prolonged exposure to human standard gravity was not harmful but was, according to the Dominion's own diplomatic notes, experienced as persistently emphatic. Finn had read this and understood it to mean that everything aboard the Meridian Pact felt, to Princess Nithara, approximately 17% more serious than it needed to. By the time evening came, ship's evening, measured in the dimming of corridor lighting and the change in crew rotation, rather than anything as straightforward as a sun. She had retreated to her quarters, and Finn had taken up his post outside. The door was impressive by any standard. It had been fitted with a Velshara security interface alongside the ship's standard lock, a layered system that Ussel had described, with evident pride, as essentially impenetrable. Finn had smiled politely at this. In his experience, the word essentially was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, but he kept the thought to himself. He settled into the particular quality of stillness that night watches required. It wasn't sleep and it wasn't full alertness. It was something in the corridor between the two, a practiced suspension of everything unnecessary while the necessary stayed running. The ship hummed. A ventilation relay cycled somewhere above him with a sound like a sigh from something very large and very tired. The corridor lights had dropped to half and the blue-gray of them made the whole passage look like the inside of a thought. 2 hours passed, then 3. He ran quiet checks at intervals, door integrity, corridor sensors, the soft feed from the ship's passive monitoring system through his earpiece. All of it nominal, all of it precisely, relentlessly fine. The kind of fine that, in Finn's professional experience, occasionally preceded something becoming very much the opposite. He told himself he was being paranoid. He told himself this was a standard overnight watch on a diplomatic vessel in monitored space, that the worst thing likely to happen was that he'd run out of interesting things to think about somewhere around hour 5, and that the senator's catering conspiracy would start to seem, by comparison, like a legitimately stimulating assignment. He checked the door feed at the 3-hour mark. Nominal. He checked it again at 3 hours and 20 minutes, because the corridor had gone very quiet in a way that felt different from the earlier quiet, and Finn had long ago learned to take his instincts seriously even when they couldn't produce documentation for their concerns. The monitoring feed showed the interior of Nithara's quarters, showed it clearly, thoroughly, and with excellent resolution, showed it empty. For approximately 4 seconds, Finn stood very still while his mind efficiently cycled through every possible explanation, ranked them by probability, discarded all the acceptable ones, and arrived at the conclusion that the sole heir to the Velshara dominion was not in her impenetrable, essentially unbreachable, diplomatically significant secured quarters. He turned. She was on the floor, not collapsed, not distressed, not the victim of anything that would require him to file an incident report in the medical category. She was simply there, approximately 6 feet from where he'd been standing, in the shallow alcove beside the corridor's environmental panel, curled on her side on what appeared to be a folded section of the blue-gray traveling coat she'd been wearing earlier, both hands tucked beneath her cheek, with the complete, undisturbed composure of someone who had made a considered decision and was entirely at peace with it. She was asleep. Finn looked at her. He looked at the door. He looked at her again. He checked his earpiece to confirm the corridor sensors hadn't flagged any movement. They hadn't, because the sensors were calibrated for threat detection and had apparently made a classification decision about a sleeping princess that Finn would have words with someone about later. He stood in the dim blue corridor of an interstellar diplomatic vessel, 3 hours into an overnight watch outside a room that was now performing the function of a very expensive empty box, and looked down at Princess Nithara of the Velshara Dominion sleeping on the floor next to his post. His first coherent thought was that Ussel was going to be unreasonable about this. His second was that she looked, against all current professional context, entirely at ease. His third, and this was the one that stayed, was that she had left a locked room to sleep closer to the door he was standing at, which meant she had known exactly where he was, which meant she had chosen this, which meant that whatever came next was going to require a conversation that his briefing materials had not in any way prepared him for. He stood very still. The ship hummed. Nithara slept. He gave her 4 minutes. This was not a decision he made consciously so much as one his body made for him, while his mind was still working through the situation's more complicated geometries. 4 minutes of standing in the dim corridor, of the ship's ventilation cycling overhead, of the passive sensor feed murmuring its indifferent stream of nominals into his earpiece, of Princess Nithara sleeping on the floor with the absolute, unhurried serenity of someone who had resolved every relevant question before closing her eyes. Then he crouched down at a respectful distance and said her name quietly. She was awake before the second syllable, not startled. That was the thing that registered first, the thing that filed itself away in the professional part of his mind and stayed there. She came awake the way certain people do, people who have been trained or who have lived in circumstances that make the slow drift out of sleep a luxury they've stopped expecting. Eyes open, present, looking at him with an expression that contained no confusion whatsoever. "Mr. Drake," she said. Her voice had the texture of someone who had been asleep but whose mind had apparently remained fully operational throughout. "Your quarters are empty," Finn said, because it seemed like the most neutral available entry point into what was shaping up to be a genuinely unusual conversation. "Yes," she said. He waited. She offered nothing further, which he was beginning to suspect was a conversational style rather than an oversight. "I noticed," he said carefully, "that you're on the floor. Also, yes, in the corridor. You have a gift for sequential observation," she said, and sat up with an unhurried dignity that managed to make the floor look like a reasonable place to have been. "It must serve you well professionally." Finn sat back on his heels and looked at her with the expression of a man who was maintaining professionalism through the application of considerable internal structural support. Princess Nithara, my responsibility is your safety. Your quarters have a security rating that this ship's coordinator described to me, with some enthusiasm, as essentially impenetrable. He used the word essentially. He did. That is a word, she said thoughtfully, that is working very hard. That's what I thought, Finn said, and then remembered that agreeing with her assessment of the ship's security infrastructure was probably not the most tactically sound position he could take right now. He redirected. The question I need to ask you, the question that is, professionally speaking, fairly urgent, is why you left. She was quiet for a moment. The corridor hummed around them, and the blue-gray light sat over everything like the memory of a color rather than the thing itself. Down the passage, a pressure seal cycled with a low, resonant clunk that the ship produced every 40 minutes or so, reliable as a heartbeat and about as remarkable. The room is very still, she said at last. Finn waited. On a Velshara vessel, she continued, with the particular precision of someone translating not just language but architecture of thought, a member of the royal household does not sleep behind a sealed door with the guard outside. The guard is inside, or adjacent. The proximity is the protection. The door is, she paused, searching, a secondary consideration. The door, Finn said slowly, is the primary consideration in our protocols. I understand that. The door is, in fact, the point of the protocols. I understand that also. She looked at him with the directness she'd shown when she first stepped off the shuttle, the kind of eye contact that didn't ask for anything and didn't apologize for itself. And yet I slept better in this corridor, in approximately that position, than I have in 2 days aboard any human-operated vessel. Finn absorbed this. Then he said, because it was the honest question, because I was here. Because you were here, she confirmed, without any apparent sense that this was a remarkable thing to confirm. He stood up, not out of discomfort exactly, but because his knees were making a mild and reasonable argument, and also because thinking was slightly easier when he was vertical. He looked down the corridor in both directions, empty, sensors clean, nothing requiring his attention except the entire situation he was currently standing inside of. I have to tell you, he said, that in 11 years of close protection work, I have guarded a sitting member of Parliament, 2 tech executives who each believed, independently, that the other had hired someone to ruin them, a musician who required all mirrors in any secured location to be covered with a specific shade of green fabric, and a foreign diplomat who communicated exclusively through a human interpreter even when he was demonstrably alone, and could have simply talked normally. He paused. Nobody has ever expressed their satisfaction with my work by sleeping on the floor next to me. How do they usually express it? She asked, with what he was increasingly certain was the Velshara equivalent of a completely straight face deployed in the service of a joke. Tip, he said, usually a tip. The architecture of a smile did what it had done earlier, arrived at the edges of her expression without quite committing to the interior. We do not have a direct cultural equivalent to the tip, she said. I will keep the concept in mind. I appreciate that. He looked at her for a moment. I still need you to go back to your quarters. I know. It's protocol. I know that also. But if Coordinator Ussel reviews the corridor logs in the morning and finds that the princess of the Velshara Dominion spent the night on the floor outside her room, the conversation I will then have to have is one I would very much prefer not to. Then perhaps, she said, with the calm of someone proposing something they have already thought through several steps ahead, you could tell me why the protocol matters more than the outcome. Finn opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again with slightly more preparation behind it. The outcome of the protocol, he said, is that you're safe. I was safe, she said simply. I was safe and I was sleeping, which is more than I have managed in 2 days, and I was 6 feet from the person whose presence made both of those things possible. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture he hadn't seen her make before, something that seemed less human and more considered, the way a question looks when it's being asked by something other than words. Where is the failure in that outcome, Mr. Drake? He didn't have an answer for that. Not an immediate one, not one that satisfied the part of him that was asking it honestly rather than professionally. The protocol answer was easy: structure, documentation, chain of responsibility, the importance of established perimeter. He knew all of it, and he believed most of it, and right now, in this corridor at this hour, with this woman sitting on the floor looking at him with those dark eyes and those long composed ears, and the complete absence of any behavior that resembled distress. The protocol answer felt like a map of a country he wasn't currently standing in. "It's not a failure," he said at last. "It's a complication." "Ah," she said, "a complication." She seemed to consider the word, turning it over in the way someone turns over an object they've been handed to determine its function. In the Dominion, when a guard and their charge have reached the point of the charge sleeping without fear, this is not considered a complication. What is it considered? She stood then, with the same unhurried dignity she'd shown throughout, the coat gathered in one hand, her hair slightly displaced from sleep, the corridor's dim light doing nothing to diminish the composure she wore like a second set of clothes. "A success," she said. "It is considered a success." She looked at him for a moment more. Then she moved past him toward her quarters, paused at the door while the Velshara lock registered her, and glanced back once. "I will return to the room," she said, "but I want you to consider, Mr. Drake, that I slept well because of where you were standing. The door opened. That is not nothing." She went inside, the lock cycled. The corridor returned to its standard hum, its blue-gray patience, its untroubled monitoring of nothing in particular. Finn stood outside a closed door that was once again performing its intended function, and looked at the floor where she'd been sleeping. At the faint impression the folded coat had left on the corridor's surface, at the 6 feet of space between that spot and his post, at the specific geography of what had just happened. He reached up and pressed 2 fingers to his earpiece, everything nominal. He exhaled slowly through his nose. He was going to need, he thought, significantly better coffee than this ship was offering. Coordinator Ussel reviewed the corridor logs at 6:43 in the morning, ship's time, which Finn knew because at 6:44 his comm device produced the particular kind of vibration that he had come to associate, over the course of a career, with someone on the other end who had recently seen something they wished they hadn't. He was already awake. He had been awake, with brief and unconvincing interruptions, for most of the night, standing his post with the conscientious thoroughness of a man who was compensating for the fact that his post had briefly included a sleeping princess on the floor beside it. The door to Nithara's quarters had remained closed and locked since she'd gone back inside. The corridor sensors had remained nominal. The ship had continued its transit through monitored deep space, with the indifferent reliability of a vessel that had no opinion about the diplomatic complications unfolding in its lower corridor. He answered the comm on the second vibration. "Mr. Drake," Ussel said, in the tone of a man who had rehearsed an opening line and then decided at the last moment that the opening line wasn't going to be sufficient. "I wonder if you might come to the coordination office at your earliest convenience." "My earliest convenience is whenever my relief arrives," Finn said, "which is 700 hours. A pause. "I'll send someone now." The coordination office was 3 corridors forward and 1 deck up. A room slightly larger than the briefing annex, with a viewport that currently showed the particular quality of darkness that existed between star systems, the kind of deep and specific nothing that tended to make human-scale problems feel briefly small, and then, when you looked away, considerably larger. Ussel was standing at the window when Finn arrived. He turned with the expression of a man who had been composing himself for several minutes and had achieved partial results. "The logs," Ussel said, "show that Princess Nithara was outside her quarters for a period of approximately 40 minutes beginning at the 3rd hour of the overnight watch." "They do," Finn said. "She was in the corridor." "She was," Sleeping. She was. Ussel looked at him with the focused attention of someone waiting for the part where this became explicable. Mr. Drake, I want to be very precise about what I am asking. I am not asking whether these things happened. The logs are thorough. I am asking how they happened, and I am particularly interested in the portion of your answer that addresses why the princess of the Velshara Dominion was asleep on the floor of this vessel's corridor rather than in her secured quarters. And why? When I review the sensor record, your position during this period shows you standing approximately 6 feet from where she was sleeping, apparently without having returned her to her room at the earliest available moment. Finn considered his response with the care of a man building something load-bearing. She left her quarters because the secured room didn't feel safe, he said. She came to the corridor because I was there, and my being there was the thing that felt safe. I woke her and we discussed it. She returned to her quarters voluntarily. He paused. She was never in any danger. She was on the floor. She was on the floor in a monitored corridor on a vessel in secure diplomatic transit with her protection officer 6 feet away, Finn said. I've worked assignments where the principal was technically in a safer physical location and was in considerably more danger. Ussel opened his mouth, found the counterargument he was reaching for wasn't quite where he'd left it, and closed it again. He turned back to the viewport. Outside, the nothing continued to be nothing, vast and thorough and entirely unhelpful. The Velshara delegation has been informed, Ussel said at last. The senior aide, Counselor Veth, wishes to speak with you this morning, and the princess has requested to be present for that conversation. Finn hadn't expected the second part. He absorbed it without showing that he hadn't expected it, which was a skill that had taken several years, and one particularly instructive incident involving a Swedish finance minister to properly develop. The meeting happened in the same conference room where Nithara had reviewed documents the previous afternoon. Counselor Veth was older, with the kind of stillness that comes not from composure, but from having simply outlasted most sources of surprise. She sat across from Finn with her hands folded on the table, and studied him for a long moment before saying anything, in the manner of someone reading a document they hadn't commissioned, but were willing to assess on its merits. Nithara sat to her counselor's left. She was composed, dressed, and gave no indication when Finn entered the room that the previous night had been anything other than an ordinary evening, except that when he sat down and their eyes met briefly across the table, there was in her expression the very faint suggestion of someone who had said a thing they meant and was not sorry they had said it. Veth spoke first in Velshara, a language that sounded, to Finn's ear, like water moving over a complicated surface, and then switched to standard with the fluid ease of long practice. Mr. Drake, I have reviewed the logs. I have spoken with the princess this morning. I want to ask you a direct question, and I would appreciate a direct answer. I'll do my best, Finn said. Did you, at any point during the overnight watch, behave in a manner that caused the princess discomfort, distress, or any form of unease? No, Finn said. Did you, at any point, fail in your responsibility to her safety? He thought about this for a moment, genuinely, not performatively. He thought about the 4 minutes he'd given her before waking her, about the conversation in the corridor, and the way she'd answered his questions with the directness of someone who knew their own mind, and had long since stopped explaining it apologetically, about the specific quality of ease she'd carried, sitting on that floor, that he had never once seen in a principal who was anything other than genuinely, fundamentally unafraid. No, he said, I don't believe I did. Veth regarded him. Then she said something in Velshara to Nithara, brief, almost casual, and Nithara responded in the same language, with a single word and the slight inclination of her head that Finn had already begun to recognize as her version of a period at the end of a sentence. Veth looked back at Finn. In the Velshara tradition, she said, a guard who has been trusted by the royal household to the degree that the royal household will sleep in their presence is not reprimanded. She paused with the timing of someone who had, it turned out, a sense of humor living quietly behind the stillness. "They are promoted." Ussel, standing near the door, made a sound that wasn't quite a cough. "I'm not sure your organizational structure has an obvious place for me," Finn said. "No," Veth agreed. "It does not, which is unfortunate." She unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table in a gesture that seemed to carry some formal weight. "What it does have is a record, and that record will note that the protection officer assigned to Princess Nithara during her first journey beyond Dominion space performed his duty in a manner that the Velshara delegation considers not merely adequate, but honorable." The word landed differently than Finn expected. Not with the weight of ceremony. He'd been given commendations before, had sat through the language of formal recognition, with the patient discomfort of a person who never quite knew what to do with their hands during such things. This was quieter than that. It felt less like a certificate and more like a door left open. He looked at Nithara. She was looking at him with the same quality of attention she'd brought to every exchange since she'd stepped off the shuttle, direct, measuring and underneath the measure, something that was neither warmth nor distance but occupied, with complete assurance, the specific territory between them. "Thank you," he said, because it was honest. The meeting ended shortly after. Ussel walked him back toward the diplomatic wing with the energy of a man who had arrived at a situation expecting wreckage and found, to his evident bewilderment, intact structures. He said very little. At the corridor junction, he stopped and looked at Finn with the expression of someone recalibrating a fairly settled set of assumptions. "You're back on post at 1400, he said. "The princess has a delegation meeting at 1600 that will require corridor presence." "Understood," Finn said. Ussel nodded. Then, with the air of a man making a significant concession to the evidence, "The coffee situation on this vessel is, I'm aware it's inadequate. I'll have something better sent to your post." Finn looked at him. "I appreciate that." Ussel left. Finn stood in the corridor junction for a moment, in the ship's recycled air and its bone-deep hum, in the light that fell the same in every passage and the darkness outside that was the particular darkness of being very far from anywhere familiar. He thought about what Nithara had said at the end of the conversation in the corridor, that she had slept well because of where he was standing, that this was not nothing. He had spent 11 years constructing safety out of protocols, perimeters, locked doors, and documented procedures. He had been good at it. He had been good at it because he believed in the architecture of it, the idea that safety was a thing you could build if you put the pieces in the right order. And all of that was true. The pieces mattered. The order mattered. But last night a princess had left an impenetrable room to sleep on a floor because the floor was where he was, and she had slept well, and nothing had harmed her. And when he'd asked her why, she'd explained it with the patience of someone describing something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Proximity to the guard felt safer than distance behind protection. He wasn't sure that was in any manual he'd ever read. He was fairly sure it should be. At 1400 he returned to his post. The corridor was quiet, the door sealed, the sensors nominal. He stood where he had stood the night before, the same 6 feet of floor, the same blue-gray patience of the ship around him. At 1423, the door opened and Nithara stepped out. She had a Velshara data folio under one arm and was 40 minutes early for her delegation meeting, which she almost certainly knew. She glanced at him as she took up a position beside him in the corridor, not behind the door, not at a diplomatic distance, but beside him, close enough for the proximity to be deliberate. "Mr. Drake," she said. "Princess," he said. The ship moved through the dark between stars. They stood together in the corridor, the guard and the one he was guarding, and in the quiet between them was the particular kind of understanding that doesn't require documentation, because both parties already know exactly what it says. It was, Finn thought, a reasonable place to start.